In November 2022, one of the largest financial frauds in American history unfolded in just 72 hours. FTX, the world's second-largest cryptocurrency exchange, collapsed with such speed and totality that even seasoned financial observers struggled to comprehend what they were witnessing. $32 billion in value evaporated. $8 billion in customer funds went missing. More than 1 million people found themselves locked out of their accounts, unable to access money they believed was safely stored on a platform they had been told to trust. At the center of this catastrophe was a 30-year-old named Sam Bankman-Fried, a man who had been celebrated as the future of finance just days before his empire crumbled. He had appeared on magazine covers, testified before Congress, and convinced some of the world's most sophisticated investors to pour billions into his company. Celebrities endorsed him. Politicians accepted his donations. Major financial institutions validated his credibility. He lived in a penthouse in the Bahamas, gave interviews while playing video games, and cultivated an image of the eccentric genius who cared more about saving the world than making money. The public saw a visionary. Regulators saw a responsible operator. Investors saw the next great financial innovator. They were all wrong. When FTX collapsed, it did not fail because of market volatility or unforeseen circumstances. It failed because customer deposits had been secretly funneled to a trading firm that gambled them away on risky bets. It failed because the safeguards that were promised to exist did not exist. It failed because the people running the company lied, repeatedly and deliberately, about what they were doing with other people's money. The question that remains is not whether FTX was a fraud, but how so many intelligent, experienced people failed to see it until it was too late. The answer lies not in complexity, but in something far simpler: fraud. Sam Bankman-Fried did not fit the stereotype of a Wall Street fraudster. He graduated from MIT with a physics degree, worked at Jane Street Capital, and positioned himself as a devotee of effective altruism of philosophy, advocating earning money to donate it. He frequently spoke about giving away his fortune, framing wealth accumulation as a moral obligation rather than a sign of greed. This narrative resonated in an industry desperate for respectability. Cryptocurrency needed a legitimate face, and Bankman-Fried provided it. In 2019, he founded FTX in Hong Kong as the safe alternative to exchanges plagued by hacks and regulatory problems. The platform's clean interface made trading accessible, and it grew rapidly. Within 2 years, FTX became one of the world's largest cryptocurrency exchanges, processing billions daily in transactions. What distinguished FTX was its marketing. Bankman-Fried enlisted Tom Brady, Gisele Bündchen, and Larry David as endorsers. David's 2022 Super Bowl commercial mocked skeptics of innovation throughout history, positioning FTX as the idea only fools would dismiss. The ad aired at the peak of FTX's legitimacy. If a company could afford Super Bowl advertising and attract celebrities of that stature, it must be trustworthy. Bankman-Fried pursued political influence aggressively. During the 2022 cycle, he donated over $40 million to candidates from both parties, becoming one of the country's largest individual political donors. He testified before Congress on cryptocurrency regulation, presenting himself as a responsible leader who welcomed oversight. His donations earned him access to lawmakers and regulators, creating legitimacy that extended beyond crypto into mainstream finance and politics. He moved FTX headquarters to the Bahamas, where he and executives lived in a multi-million-dollar penthouse. The location offered favorable regulation and minimal oversight. He hosted parties and cultivated relationships with local authorities in an environment where questions were rarely asked. His public persona was carefully constructed to appear uncalculated. He wore t-shirts and shorts to investor meetings, played video games during interviews, and projected indifference to conventional professionalism. He repeatedly claimed not to care about money, that he lived modestly, and that his only goal was accumulating wealth to give away. The disheveled appearance, casual attitude, and philosophical justifications reinforced the narrative that he was different, motivated by ideals rather than greed. But behind the image was a company built on a lie. FTX presented itself to the public as a secure cryptocurrency exchange where users could deposit funds, trade digital assets, and withdraw their money whenever they chose. The platform's terms of service explicitly stated that customer funds would not be lent out or used for investments without permission. This was a critical promise, one that distinguished FTX from other platforms that had failed after making risky bets with user deposits. Customers believed their money was sitting safely in segregated accounts, untouched and available on demand. That belief was central to FTX's appeal and its rapid growth. But FTX was not operating alone. Before launching the exchange, Bankman-Fried had founded Alameda Research in 2017, a quantitative trading firm designed to exploit inefficiencies in cryptocurrency markets. Alameda was supposed to be a separate entity, a private trading operation that had no special relationship with FTX, beyond being one of many clients using the platform. In reality, the two companies were inseparable. They shared office space, they shared leadership, and most importantly, they shared finances in ways that were never disclosed to FTX's customers or the public. Alameda held a unique position on FTX. It was granted special privileges that no other user enjoyed, including an exemption from the automatic liquidation mechanisms that would normally prevent a trading account from borrowing more than it could repay. This backdoor in the system allowed Alameda to access essentially unlimited credit from FTX, drawing on the exchange's reserves whenever it needed capital for trades. Those reserves, unbeknownst to the users who had deposited funds on the platform, were not just sitting idle. They were being quietly transferred to Alameda to finance its trading operations. The relationship between the two companies was not just financial, but personal. Caroline Ellison, the CEO of Alameda Research, was Bankman-Fried's ex-girlfriend. She reported to him, worked alongside him, and was fully aware of the arrangement that allowed Alameda to use FTX customer funds. Messages that would later surface during legal proceedings showed that she and other executives understood the risks they were taking and the deception they were perpetuating. They discussed the growing gap between what FTX owed to customers and what it actually had in reserve, and they continued operating as if the gap would somehow resolve itself. In November 2022, a leaked document exposed the fragility of this structure. CoinDesk, a cryptocurrency news outlet, obtained Alameda's balance sheet and published details that raised immediate alarm. The document revealed that a significant portion of Alameda's assets consisted of FTT, FTX's own proprietary token. This was a red flag. A trading firm should hold liquid, diversified assets that can be sold quickly in any market condition. Instead, Alameda's balance sheet was propped up by a token that had value only because people believed in FTX. If confidence in FTX wavered, the token would lose value and Alameda's assets would evaporate. More troubling still, the balance sheet suggested that Alameda had borrowed billions of dollars, and the source of those loans was not disclosed. The implication was clear to anyone paying attention. Alameda owed money it could not easily repay, and the collateral backing its debts was illusory. The leak shattered the illusion of separation between FTX and Alameda. It revealed that the two companies were not independent entities operating at arm's length, but rather two sides of the same operation, with customer funds flowing freely from one to the other. When the market turned, the house of cards began to collapse. On November 2, 2022, CoinDesk published the leaked Alameda balance sheet, and the questions that had been quietly circulating in crypto circles suddenly became public. The document showed that Alameda's financial health depended heavily on FTT, the token issued by FTX itself. This created a circular dependency that made both companies vulnerable. If FTT lost value, Alameda's assets would shrink. If Alameda collapsed, confidence in FTX would erode, causing FTT to lose value. The structure was inherently unstable, and once exposed, it took only days to unravel. 4 days later, Changpeng Zhao, CEO of Binance, announced that his company would be selling all of its FTT holdings. Zhao's decision to liquidate was framed as routine risk management, but the public announcement sent a clear signal. One of the most powerful figures in crypto no longer had confidence in FTX. The price of FTT began to drop immediately. What followed was a classic bank run. Customers who had trusted FTX with their money suddenly feared the platform might not be able to return it. Withdrawal requests flooded in, reaching $6 billion within hours. FTX reserves, which should have been sufficient to meet normal demand, were not there. The money had been moved to Alameda, where it had been used to make leveraged bets that were now underwater. As more customers tried to withdraw, the gap between what FTX owed and what it could actually pay became impossible to hide. On November 8th, FTX froze withdrawals. The company claimed it was working to process requests, but the reality was stark. There was not enough money to give back to customers. People who had deposited their savings were now locked out of their accounts with no clear explanation of when or if they would ever see their funds again. In a desperate attempt to salvage the situation, Bankman-Fried reached out to Zhao and negotiated what appeared to be a rescue deal. Binance agreed to acquire FTX, and for a brief moment, it seemed the crisis might be contained. Binance was large enough to absorb FTX's liabilities, and Zhao's involvement lent credibility. But the optimism lasted less than 24 hours. On November 9th, after examining FTX's financial records, Binance withdrew from the deal. Reports emerged that Binance had discovered an $8 billion hole in FTX's balance sheet. The money was simply gone, transferred to Alameda, and lost in failed trades. There was no realistic path to recovery. 2 days later, on November 11th, FTX filed for bankruptcy. Bankman-Fried resigned as CEO. The company that had been valued at barely $2 billion just months earlier was now insolvent. In the filings that followed, it became clear that customer funds had been commingled with Alameda's assets, that basic financial controls had been non-existent, and that leadership had known about the problems for months while continuing to assure the public that everything was fine. The collapse exposed not just missing money, but deliberate deception. The $8 billion shortfall did not result from a series of unfortunate market movements or unforeseeable events. It resulted from a systematic transfer of customer deposits from FTX to Alameda Research, where the money was used to cover trading losses, fund investments, and finance a lifestyle that bore no relationship to the actual profitability of either company. This was not a mistake. It was theft, executed through a deliberate manipulation of the platform code and concealed through false statements that continued until the moment collapse became unavoidable. At the heart of the fraud was a piece of code built into FTX system that exempted Alameda from the standard risk controls applied to every other user. When a typical trading account on FTX approached insolvency, the platform automated systems would liquidate positions to prevent the account from borrowing more than it could repay. Alameda faced no such constraint. It could borrow unlimited amounts from FTX reserves, drawing on customer deposits whenever it needed capital. This backdoor allowed Alameda to operate as if it had access to an infinite line of credit, funded not by banks or investors, but by the ordinary people who had entrusted their money to FTX. The money flowed out in multiple directions. More than $300 million was spent on real estate in the Bahamas, including luxury properties where Bankman-Fried and his executives lived and worked. These purchases were not disclosed to customers, and they were not made with profits legitimately earned through trading or exchange fees. They were made with deposits that should have been held in reserve to meet withdrawal requests. The properties served both as personal residences and as symbols of the success that FTX projected to the outside world, reinforcing the illusion that the company was thriving. Political donations, which had helped Bankman-Fried cultivate influence in Washington, were also funded with customer money. The more than $40 million he contributed during the 2022 election cycle did not come from his personal wealth, as he had implied in interviews and public statements. It came from FTX, which in turn had taken it from customer accounts without permission or disclosure. The donations bought access and credibility, allowing Bankman-Fried to testify before Congress and shape regulatory discussions while actively committing fraud. Venture capital investments consumed hundreds of millions more. FTX and Alameda poured money into startups, celebrity endorsement deals, and sponsorship agreements that had little to do with the core business of running a cryptocurrency exchange. These investments were presented as evidence of the company's financial strength and its commitment to building the future of finance. In reality, they were made with funds that did not belong to the company and could not be sustained once the flow of new customer deposits slowed. The spending extended to private jets, luxury apartments, and marketing campaigns that included the Super Bowl advertisement featuring Larry David. Every dollar spent on these extravagances was a dollar that could not be returned to a customer who requested a withdrawal. The executives involved in these decisions were not operating under the belief that the money would eventually be repaid through profitable trading. Internal messages later revealed that they understood the gap between assets and liabilities was growing, and they discussed how to manage the optics of the situation without addressing the underlying reality. Throughout this period, Bankman-Fried made repeated public statements, assuring customers that their funds were safe, that FTX maintained strict separation between customer deposits and company operations, and that the platform adhered to industry best practices for security and risk management. These statements were false. He knew they were false when he made them. So did the other executives at FTX and Alameda, including Carolyn Ellison, who later testified that the companies had been using customer funds to cover Alameda's losses for years, not just during the final chaotic weeks before the collapse. The messages exchanged among the leadership in the months leading up to the bankruptcy showed a group of people who were fully aware of what they were doing. They discussed the shortfall. They strategized about how to raise additional capital to cover the gap. They worried about what would happen if customers began withdrawing in large numbers, but they did not stop. They did not disclose the truth. They continued to operate as if the problem could be managed indefinitely, even as the risks compounded, and the likelihood of catastrophic failure became increasingly certain. As customers lost everything, the consequences became clear. When FTX filed for bankruptcy, more than 1 million creditors found themselves locked out of their accounts with no clear path to recovering their funds. These were individuals who had saved money for years, small businesses that had kept operating capital on the platform, and charitable organizations that had trusted FTX with donations intended for humanitarian work. Teachers who had invested their retirement savings, freelancers who had stored the proceeds of years of work, families who had pooled resources to buy cryptocurrency as a hedge against inflation, only to discover that the hedge had vanished. Many had no prior experience with financial fraud and no understanding of the legal mechanisms that would govern the bankruptcy process. They simply wanted their money back, and they learned that recovery, if it came at all, would take years and would likely return only a fraction of what they had lost. Institutional investors also suffered enormous losses. Sequoia Capital had invested over $200 million in FTX and was forced to write the entire investment down to zero. BlackRock, SoftBank, and other major financial institutions had similarly placed large bets on the company. Swayed by the same narrative that had convinced retail customers, these firms had resources and expertise that ordinary individuals did not. Yet they failed to detect the fraud that was occurring beneath the surface. In December 2022, Bankman-Fried was arrested in the Bahamas and extradited to face 8 counts of fraud and money laundering. He pleaded not guilty and attempted to argue that the collapse was the result of mismanagement rather than intentional fraud. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. The trial began in October 2023, and his former colleagues testified against him. Carolyn Ellison provided detailed testimony about how customer funds had been used to cover trading losses, how Bankman-Fried had directed the scheme, and how the inner circle had knowingly deceived investors and customers. The jury found him guilty on all counts. In March 2024, he was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Regulatory agencies faced criticism for failing to detect the fraud despite warning signs that had been visible for years. FTX had operated with minimal oversight, taking advantage of gaps in the regulatory framework. Officials had met with Bankman-Fried, accepted his assurances that the company was well managed, and failed to conduct the kind of thorough examination that might have uncovered the misuse of customer funds before the collapse. The broader impact on the cryptocurrency industry was immediate and severe. Other exchanges faced withdrawals as customers lost confidence in the industry as a whole. Calls for comprehensive regulation intensified. The collapse of FTX became a case study in the dangers of unregulated financial markets and the ease with which trust can be exploited when oversight is absent. The story of FTX is not just about one man's crime. The collapse of FTX was not an anomaly. It followed a pattern that has repeated throughout financial history, from Charles Ponzi in the 1920s to Bernie Madoff in 2008. A charismatic figure builds trust through celebrity endorsements and political connections, uses complexity as a smokescreen to discourage scrutiny, and exploits that trust to misappropriate funds until the scheme inevitably collapses. Bankman-Fried deployed every element of this playbook, cultivating relationships with famous athletes, donating to politicians. and speaking in technical jargon that created the impression his operations were too sophisticated for outsiders to understand. Cryptocurrency was supposed to solve the problem of trust. The entire premise of blockchain technology is that transactions can be verified without relying on a central authority. But FTX exposed the limitations of that promise. Most people do not interact directly with blockchains. They use exchanges, which are centralized institutions that hold customer funds and execute trades on their behalf. These exchanges require trust, and in the absence of regulation, that trust is easy to abuse. By establishing its headquarters in the Bahamas, FTX placed itself beyond the reach of robust American financial oversight. The jurisdiction offered minimal regulatory requirements, and when problems emerged, there was no clear authority responsible for monitoring the company's activities or protecting its customers: the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Commodity Futures Trading Commission both claimed jurisdiction over aspects of cryptocurrency markets, but neither had the resources to conduct comprehensive oversight that might have detected the misuse of customer funds. The warning signs were visible long before the collapse. FTX offered yields that seemed too good to be true. Its financials were opaque. The relationship between FTX and Alameda Research was an obvious conflict of interest. Bankman-Fried himself embodied contradictions that should have raised concerns. A billionaire who claimed not to care about money, a philanthropist who spent lavishly on real estate and political influence, a proponent of regulation who operated in one of the least regulated jurisdictions on the planet. But the cult of personality that surrounded him distracted from basic due diligence. The consequences extended far beyond FTX's own customers. The cryptocurrency industry is deeply interconnected, and when FTX failed, it triggered a contagion that spread to other companies. Lending platforms that had extended credit to FTX or Alameda faced their own liquidity crises. Smaller exchanges saw withdrawals surge. The collapse revealed that much of the industry's apparent strength was built on interconnected vulnerabilities that could cascade rapidly once confidence was lost. At its core, the failure of FTX was simple. Customers deposited money believing it would be held safely and returned on demand. Instead, it was transferred to a trading firm where it was gambled on risky bets, used to finance political donations and luxury real estate, and ultimately lost. The complexity of the technology and the credibility of the endorsers served to obscure this basic reality. FTX promised to revolutionize finance. Instead, it repeated the oldest fraud in history. It took money from people who could not afford to lose it, spent it on things that benefited the few rather than the many, and collapsed when the gap between promises and reality became impossible to conceal. The technology was new. The rhetoric was forward-looking, but the crime was ancient. $32 billion did not vanish overnight. It was stolen slowly while the world watched and believed. The collapse of FTX was not a failure of technology or an accident of circumstance. It was fraud, deliberate and systematic, carried out by people who knew exactly what they were doing. The platform that promised transparency operated in darkness. The leader who claimed indifference to wealth spent customer money on mansions and influence. The exchange that positioned itself as safe was gambling with deposits from the first day. Trust, once given, is difficult to verify. And in the absence of regulation, verification, and accountability, trust becomes the most dangerous currency of all. The FTX illusion has been shattered. What remains is a cautionary tale about what happens when belief replaces scrutiny and image replaces truth.